what constitute lessening of competition. So that brings us to section 18. But remember now, what we have said is that there are two sets of prohibitions: the reason of rule or rule of reason prohibition and the per se prohibition. Section 18 would fall into the per se prohibition, right? And this speaks about agreements containing exclusionary provisions and that these are prohibited. So the agreement is entered into or arrived at between persons of whom any two or more are in competition with each other. And the effect of the provision is to prevent or restrict or limit the supply of goods or services from any person or class of persons by all or any of the parties to the agreement or by their interconnected companies. So exclusionary provisions are void and thereby unenforceable. So the idea is trying to lock out the competition, and you have arranged agreements so to do. So section 19 speaks about the existence of dominant position, and this is important because part of the rule of reason prohibitions is the business here of abuse of dominant position. So we need to know what we mean when we say dominant position. And related to dominant position is also the idea of lessening competition, substantially lessening competition. So section 19 of the Act tells us that for the purpose of this Act, an enterprise owes a dominant position in a market if by itself or together with an interconnected company it occupies such a position of economic strength as will enable it to operate in the market without effective constraints from its competitors or potential competitors. So in other words, it is the main player in the market that no matter what the competition does, it is setting the pace, whether it is prices, whether it is quality of goods and services, range of goods and services, and so on. And the decisions that it takes will ultimately influence the market forces. No. So here, section 20 subsection 1 tells us that an enterprise abuses a dominant position if it impedes the maintenance or development of effective competition in a market, and in particular, but without prejudice to the generality of the foregoing. If it, so a business owes a dominant position in a market if by itself or together with an unconnected person, and we have done this already, it occupies a position of economic strength, enabling it to operate in the market without effective constraints. So again, one could use the word a monopoly, and the telecommunications sector lends itself to examples, because remember that we were moving from a monopolistic position to a free market position where you had an entrant into the market such as Digicel, and then that expanded from cable and wireless. Digicel went to Flow, and there were some smaller service providers in that space, and then ultimately you had Oceanic Digital called Claro then come into the market space. But for a long while, what was then cable and wireless, Lime, ultimately becoming Flow, was seen as the dominant player until the script was flipped and Digicel had a greater market share than that of Lime or cable and wireless and Flow. So the idea is you can move from a monopoly to a dominant position, right? And you are now able to determine what prices are, and you may be able to restrict entry into the market or restrict competition. So a business abuses a dominant position if it impedes the maintenance or development of effective competition in a market. So if you are doing everything to discourage competition, lowering your prices to the point where you're running them out of business, then that could be seen as abusing dominant position. Second thing is if you restrict the entry of any person into any other market. So again, when the telecommunication sector was opening up, a player like Digicel had to rely on the network of Lime to terminate their calls, and what you would find is that the cost of making a call would be expensive if you were calling from, say, a Digicel phone line to a Flow phone line, or to a Lime phone line, or a cable and wireless phone line at that point in time, because you had what was referred to as termination rates, and therefore cable and wireless would charge persons using cable and wireless less to use their network. So if you're calling a cable and wireless to a cable and wireless, the price would be lower, as opposed if you're calling a Digicel calling cable and wireless, the price would be higher, because you would then now having to pay cable and wireless a premium to land that call on that exchange. And in a sense, that was one of the reasons why Jamaicans developed more than one telecommunication provider culture. So they would have a Lime phone or a cable and wireless phone, and they would have a Digicel phone, because it's cheaper to call Digicel to Digicel than to call Digicel to Lime, and vice versa, right? But at the time, cable and wireless, Lime was the dominant player, and therefore Digicel had to rely on their network if their callers wanted to call over to Lime or cable and wireless. And ultimately, what Digicel began to do when they built out their network and was now trying to woo customers, is that they made their Digicel to Digicel calls cheaper than their Digicel to Lime calls or cable and wireless calls. And then ultimately, they also would give an incentive for people to get Digicel phones, because their rates would be lower, because they were trying to enter the market. But it is an abuse of dominant position if there are barriers to entry that are placed in the marketplace. Then the third circumstance that there is an abuse of dominant position is if you attempt to remove the competition from the market. So if you try to eliminate or remove any person from any other market, then clearly that is an abuse. The fourth point here is that it is also an abuse if there is directly or indirectly unfair purchase or selling prices or other uncompetitive practice. And again, during that teething process, when we were moving from a monopoly position in terms of cable and wireless to liberalized telecommunication sector, one would argue that there might have been an attempt to have eliminated the competition by pricing. And some of us would be old enough to remember the price wars that took place between cable and wireless and Digicel, and we have come a long way now, because you now have number mobility or number portability. So if you want to change network but not your number, that is now possible. So the fifth is limit production of goods or services to the prejudice of consumers. And I like to use OPEC as an example. Oil producing exporting countries, that they operate a cartel, and therefore their thing is completely uncompetitive, and they can ramp up production, cut production at will, and it is not usually with the consumers in mind that they do this. Then the sixth circumstance when a business abuses a dominant position is if it makes the conclusion of agreement subject to acceptance by other parties of supplementary obligation which by their nature or according to commercial usage have no connection with the subject of such arrangement. So again, you're trying to tie people to arrangements that are not germane or relevant to the main business at hand. So if you're in car rental business but you want to tie car rental to goat rearing as an for argument's sake, then clearly that is not in the line of business that you are in, and if that is the circumstance, it would be an abuse of dominant position. So as we continue to look at abuse of dominant position, section 20 subsection 2 is instructive. So here, an enterprise shall not be treated as abusing a dominant position if it is shown that its behavior was exclusively directed to improving the production or distribution of goods or to promoting technical or economic progress. So important again, and this language is very similar to the exemption in relation to section 17(1) of the Act. So once it is that the company can demonstrate, or the entity or the person can demonstrate that what they're doing is that they are seeking to improve production, and seeking to improve the distribution of goods, and to promote technical and economic progress, then that is not a breach of dominant position. And this is section 20, subsection 2, paragraph A, subparagraph 1. Then, if the consumers are allowed a fair share of the results, right, then that is not an abuse. And likewise, by reason only that the enterprise enforces or seek to enforce any right under or existing by virtue of any copyright, patent, registered design, or trademark. So those are not abuse of dominant position. Those are exceptions to the general rule. So you can take a look at those provisions and familiarize yourself with the exceptions. Likewise, if the business enforces or seeks to enforce any right under any copyright, patent, registered design, or trademark, so intellectual property, once you're seeking to protect and preserve your intellectual property rights, that cannot be deemed to be abuse of dominant position. So for instance, and I like to use this example very lightly, no plug for them, Jamaicans are very fond of their KFC, and KFC advertises that it has what you call a secret recipe. That secret recipe is its patent or its intellectual property, and one could not say that KFC is preventing other people from entering the fried chicken market because they are not sharing their secret recipe with them, right? That is not an abuse of dominant position in those circumstances. Then section 21 subsection 1 speaks about what actions can be taken in relation to abuse of dominant position. And here, if the commission finds that a business has abused or is abusing a dominant position, and the abuse is likely to substantially lessen competition in the market, then the commission determines that the entity is in violation of section 20, then it notifies the business of its findings and direct the business to take necessary steps to overcome the effect of the abuse in the market concerned. And in determining, for the purposes of subsection 1, whether a practice has had or is likely to have the effect of lessening competition substantially in a market, Commission shall consider whether the practice is a result of superior competitive performance. So in other words, if it is not, if the effect of lessening competition materializes, but it is because of superior competitive performance, then that is not an offense, and that, I believe, is what need to be clear. So subsection 3 of section 21 tells us that for the purposes of this section, an act is not an uncompetitive practice if it is engaged in pursuant only to the exercise of any right or enjoyment of an interest derived from under any act pertaining to intellectual and industrial property. And I mean, we have repeated this several times. So in relation to copyright, in relation to trademark, in relation to other intellectual properties, patents, that is not a act if one is seeking to protect one's interest. So we come now to collective bargaining agreements by supplier, collective agreements, that is, by suppliers prohibited, and section 22 of the Act. So section 22 tells us that 2 or more business suppliers of goods are prohibited from entering into or carrying out any agreement in which they undertake to withhold supplies of goods from dealers or who resell or have resold goods in breach of any condition as to price at which the goods may be resold. So one could say that this is a variant of artificially determining what the price is, what prices are, right? Refuse to supply goods to such dealers except on terms less favorable than those applicable to other dealers carrying out similar business. So you know, there's discrimination that is taking place here related to the first point. So for instance, you enter into an agreement and you're saying that we will sell you these goods at a certain price, and you have to then sell them at a certain price, not having any regards to market forces. And if they do not comply, then you now seek to refuse to supply them goods on the basis that they did not fall in line. Then 3 recovers penalties, however described by or on behalf of parties to the agreement for dealers who resell or have resold goods in breach of maintained prices. So again, there's a punitive aspect here. So you know, I would want to say this is collusion at its best in terms of prices, in terms of distribution, and so on. So collective agreements in by dealers prohibited. So we're looking at these are what we would now call the per se prohibitions, right? So these activities are strictly prohibited. And here, section 23 tells us that 2 or more dealers are prohibited from entering into or carrying out any agreement by which they undertake to withhold orders for supply of goods from suppliers who, 1, supply or have supplied goods without imposing price maintenance conditions. So now you are restricting them, but it's not necessarily on the basis of price. So refrain or have refrained from taking steps to ensure compliance with price maintenance condition in respect of goods supplied by them. Recover penalties, however described. So if you notice, these provisions are similar to the one before. The one before was dealing with suppliers. Now we are talking about agreements with dealers. So prohibition applies to associations. You will recall that at the top of the lecture we made the point that in relation to professional bodies and professional associations, the Fair Competition Act does not apply generally. However, when it comes on to prices, when it comes on to control of services, when it comes on to control of goods, these per se prohibitions are applicable to these associations, right? So the idea here is that there's not to be collusion. That is the word that I am using to describe fettering of market forces, so that demand and supply is not operating freely and fairly. So the unlawfulness of collective agreements to apply restrictive conditions by suppliers and dealers on the sale and resale of goods extend to associations of suppliers and dealers, and that is, they are prohibited from colluding to impose restrictive terms on supply, sale, and the resale of goods. So that's a critical point here. Now, minimum resale price, section 25. So section 25 tells us that any term or condition of an agreement for the sale of goods by a supplier to a dealer which purports to establish or provide for the establishment of a minimum prices to be charged on the resale of goods is prohibited. So I like to use the example, and I've used the example of Pepsi when they came out with the small $50 bottle. You may suggest a price, but ultimately market forces are to determine what the prices are, and also inflation, right? So it's not that the person won't be able to mark up necessarily, and here's the point that is being made. So the idea is where there is a fixing of prices as opposed to a recommendation as to what the resale price is. So if you take, I use Pepsi, but let's go to phone cards. So phone cards, each provider of phone cards or each seller of phone card, the service provider suggests that a $100 phone card, for argument's sake, must be sold at $108 or should be sold at $108. This is a recommendation they are making. However, depending on which reseller you go to, you may get that $108 card for $125, for $135, and so on. So here the manufacturer or the entity, the telecom entity is saying that yes, it's a $100 phone card and you should sell it at 108, but that is a suggestion, right? It allows the person who is reselling to put their markup on it. So section 27 speaks about what is meant by maintenance of minimum resale prices by other means. So it makes it unlawful for a supplier to withhold supplies of any goods from a dealer seeking to obtain them for resale on the ground that the dealer, one, has sold or obtained goods from that supplier at a price below the resale price, or has supplied goods to a third party who has done so. So again, the idea here is that the person is seeking to manipulate the price and that they are not being driven by market forces. So it is likely, if the goods are supplied to him, to sell them at a price below that price, or to supply them to a third party who would likely do so. So the resale price means any price notified to the dealer by the supplier of goods as the price or minimum price which is to be charged. So I used again Pepsi coming out with a small bottle that they suggested should be retailed for $60. So if the person now, the end user now buys that bottle and decides to sell it at $55, the question is whether or not that is in breach, whether that is unlawful, and is it going to affect or distort the prices in the market? The first thing to comment is that if they sell it below that price of $60, will they make any money? That's the first thing. So chances are they may not sell it below that price because they are not likely to see a margin. And obviously, if the suppliers are selling it to them and suggesting that they retail it at 60, then the likelihood is that they would have got it at a reduced price in any. So now that brings us to section 33, where we're dealing with exclusive dealing, market restrictions, and tied selling. And bear in mind that section 33 is I would say a hybrid, because it involves both rules of reason prohibitions as well as per se prohibitions, right? So we're looking at exclusive dealings and market restrictions. Now, market restrictions refer to the practice by which a supplier, as a condition of supplying goods to a customer, requires that customer to supply these and any other good, for example, in a prescribed market only. This practice leads to a restriction of intra-brand, same brand, competition, and is prohibited under Section 17, Section 20, and Section 33 of the Fair Competition Act. An example of a situation in which market restriction may occur is where a supplier offers dealership contracts only in defined areas, so that each dealer has control over particular areas and as such does not compete with the other dealers. In effect, each dealer acquires a monopoly status in a defined area. So market restriction may, however, be permitted under Section 33 of the Fair Competition Act if it is found to be temporary and or it is practiced between interconnected companies. So if you take the cable sector as an example, when cable was being formalized, at least 2 licenses were granted for as a geographic area, so that there was no monopoly in that specific area, right? And then ultimately bigger players came in and started to offer island-wide cable coverage, therefore creating competition across the country. So the idea here is that you're trying to create monopolies in geographic areas, and that is what we mean when we speak about exclusive dealing, market restriction. And this of course is prohibited, because what you want to do is to have competition, right? And if you have a situation where there's exclusive dealing, market restriction that prevents the entry of other players into the market, then ultimately that will have the effect of lessening competition. Remember, once competition is lessened substantially, then that is a breach of the act. So one would want to look at that. And exclusive dealing can refer to agreement between supplier or manufacturer or customer and a wholesaler or a retailer. Any combination of those can get into arrangements that are restrictive or that are exclusive in their dealing. Now again, if it is that the intent is to improve quality of service and improve goods that are available, then one may make an argument that that might be exempt. Now, tied selling is strictly prohibited, and what is it that we mean by tied selling? But we'll come to that. So here we have a definition of what we mean when we speak about exclusive dealing, and this is any practice whereby a supplier of goods as a condition of supplying the goods requires that customer to deal only or primarily in goods supplied by or designated by the supplier, or refrain from dealing in a specific class or kind of good except as supplied by the supplier, and any practice where a supplier of goods induces a customer to meet any of the above by offering to supply goods to the customer on more favorable terms if the customer agrees to meet that condition. That is exclusive dealing. And market restriction means any practice whereby a supplier of goods as a condition of supplying the goods to a customer requires that customer to supply any goods only in a defined market or exacts a penalty of any kind from the customer if he supplies any goods outside a defined market. And of course, the definition of tight selling, any practice whereby a seller of goods and services as a condition of supplying the goods or services to a customer requires the customer to 1. Acquire any other good or service from the supplier or is nominee. 2. Refrain from using or distributing in connection with the tied goods any other goods that are not a brand or manufactured designated by the supplier or is a nominee. Any practice whereby a supplier of goods and services induces a customer to meet a condition set out in A by offering to supply the tied goods or service to the customer on more favorable terms or condition, and the customers agree to meet that condition.